NATO without faith. When an alliance lives on paper but dies in practice, the alliance that learned how to die quietly. Military alliances, like empires, rarely perish in the manner their architects once imagined. They do not often collapse in moments of drama, with treaties torn up and flags lowered to the sound of brass bands. More commonly, they fade, continuing to exist formally while losing the substance that once made them decisive. In the modern international system, institutions are remarkably good at surviving their own irrelevance. NATO is approaching that condition. This is not a story of bankruptcy or neglect. The alliance is not short of money, nor is it short of threats. Russia remains militarily present and politically revisionist. China, though geographically distant, is increasingly embedded in European security calculations through technology, infrastructure, and polar access. NATO continues to expand its membership, convene its summits, publish its communiques, and rehearse its exercises. On paper, it looks vigorous, yet alliances do not derive their power from balance sheets or bureaucratic momentum. They derive it from belief that commitments will be honored even when inconvenient, costly, or politically uncomfortable. When that belief erodes, an alliance does not need to be dismantled. It simply stops working. The 20th century offers clear contrasts. The Warsaw Pact collapsed visibly because the political order sustaining it collapsed first. Its dissolution was theatrical because the faith sustaining it had already evaporated entirely. NATO's predicament is subtler. It faces not ideological collapse, but moral dilution. Its problem is not that its members disagree about enemies, but that they increasingly disagree about one another. What NATO is experiencing is not decay through neglect, but decay through reinterpretation. Its founding purpose, collective defense rooted in the assumption of shared vital interests, has slowly been reframed into something more transactional, more conditional, and ultimately more fragile. The alliance has learned how to survive without trusting itself. That is a dangerous skill. Article 5 and the myth of automaticity. No sentence in modern strategic history is quoted more reverently, or more misleadingly, than Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. An attack on one shall be considered an attack on all is often invoked as if it were a physical law, akin to gravity or thermodynamics. In reality, it is neither automatic nor self-executing. Article 5 has always been a political instrument masquerading as a legal guarantee. It functions only because three unwritten conditions have historically supported it. First, political will, above all in Washington. NATO's deterrent power has never rested on European militaries alone. It has rested on the expectation that the United States would treat an attack on an ally as indistinguishable from an attack on itself. Second, consensus about what constitutes an attack. This has never been trivial. Hybrid warfare, cyber operations, economic coercion, and political destabilization all strain the definition. Article 5 has always required interpretation. Third, and most crucially, belief that defending allies ultimately serves the defender's own long-term interests. This belief cannot be legislated. It cannot be forced. And once lost, it is exceptionally difficult to restore. The first two conditions can survive negotiation and ambiguity. The third cannot survive doubt. When allies begin to suspect that their security is no longer regarded as intrinsically valuable, but merely as leverage in broader bargaining, Article 5 does not need to be rewritten to lose force. It merely needs to stop being believed. Deterrence fails not when promises are broken, but when they are no longer trusted to be kept. This is why rhetoric matters. When a U.S. president publicly questions whether certain allies are worth defending, or implies that protection is contingent on financial contribution alone, the damage is not rhetorical. It is structural. Each such statement reframes the alliance from a community of fate into a service arrangement. And services, by definition, can be renegotiated, or withdrawn. The danger for NATO is not that Article 5 will be repealed. It is that it will become a clause lawyers debate while strategists quietly discount it. America's shift, from guarantor to negotiator. For most of NATO's existence, the United States occupied a peculiar position of restrained dominance. Washington often dictated strategy, occasionally overruled allies, and frequently acted unilaterally beyond Europe. But there remained one constraint it largely respected: Allied sovereignty within the alliance was treated as politically inviolable. This restraint was not altruism. It was strategic discipline. American policymakers understood that NATO's value lay precisely in its predictability. Allies needed to believe that American power would not be turned against them, even indirectly, if the alliance was to function as a credible deterrent. That assumption is now under strain. Donald Trump did not invent America's transactional instincts. He exposed them. His worldview is unapologetically commercial: alliances are contracts, security is a service, and services must generate returns. Within that logic, allies cease to be moral red lines and become variables in negotiation. This shift matters less for what it threatens than for what it normalizes. Once the idea is openly entertained that Allied territory, strategic assets, or political choices are subject to American leverage, the taboo is broken. NATO ceases to be a protected space and becomes simply another arena of power politics, the open discussion in Washington of ways to secure control over Greenland, through purchase, association, or coercive pressure, illustrates this transformation with unusual clarity. Greenland is not merely an Arctic landmass. It is territory linked to Denmark, a full NATO member. Treating it as negotiable territory sends a message no communique can undo. Alliance membership no longer guarantees immunity from the strongest allies' ambitions. This is not about the likelihood of military action. It is about precedent. Alliances operate as much on imagined limits as on formal rules. Once those limits are publicly tested, uncertainty spreads. And uncertainty is poison to deterrence. America, in this emerging posture, no longer acts solely as guarantor. It increasingly behaves as arbitrator, deciding which commitments are essential, which are optional, and which may be revised in pursuit of narrower interests. From Washington's perspective, this may look like strategic realism. From Europe's perspective, it looks like conditional protection. The result is not immediate rupture. It is something more corrosive, a recalibration of expectations. Allies begin to hedge. Adversaries begin to probe. And an alliance designed to remove doubt becomes a generator of it. Greenland, or the day the taboo was named. Every alliance has its unspoken taboos. NATO's most important one was never written into any treaty. The strongest member does not coerce the territory of the others. It was not codified because it was assumed. Like most assumptions that endure for decades, it survived precisely because nobody thought to test it. Until they did. Greenland is not, by most measures, a tempting prize. It is sparsely populated, brutally cold, and politically peripheral. Its strategic value lies less in what it is than in what it represents, geography that matters more as signal than substance. That is what makes it dangerous. The United States has long had military interests there. No European strategist disputes that. What is new is not interest, but tone. When Washington begins to discuss control of Allied-linked territory in openly transactional terms, purchase, pressure, options on the table, it does something NATO has never had to confront: it converts a theoretical impossibility into a debatable scenario. This is not how alliances are supposed to behave. They are meant to externalize threat, not internalize it. NATO was designed so that fear pointed outward, not inward. Greenland reverses the arrow. If the United States were to apply sustained economic or political pressure on Denmark to secure control, never mind military force, the alliance would face a paradox so uncomfortable that no amount of summit choreography could conceal it. NATO would discover that it possesses no mechanism to deter its own leading power. An alliance created to protect small states from great powers would find itself watching politely as the greatest power adjusts the map. The alliance would not collapse. That would be too clean. It would do what institutions do best when faced with existential contradiction: issue statements, reaffirm principles, and avoid the word precedent. Meanwhile, every other member would quietly note that something fundamental had changed. Greenland matters not because it is likely to be seized, but because it can be discussed as if it were. In strategic terms, that is enough. De facto dissolution. When deterrence becomes selective, an alliance does not need to fail everywhere to fail decisively. It needs only to fail where it matters most. NATO's risk is not universal paralysis, it is selective hesitation. A NATO that has collapsed in practice displays familiar symptoms. The machinery continues to hum. Headquarters remain staffed, exercises proceed, intelligence circulates. The rituals are performed with admirable professionalism. To an external observer, the institution appears intact, but politics quietly detaches from structure. Strategic trust erodes unevenly. Some allies feel protected, others feel tolerated. Objectives fragment. The question shifts from what must we defend to what are we prepared to defend this time. Deterrence, in this condition, becomes asymmetric. Adversaries no longer need to believe that NATO will not respond. They need only believe that the response is conditional, debated, and slow. In deterrence theory, doubt is often as effective as denial. This is why de facto dissolution is more dangerous than formal collapse. A collapsed alliance produces clarity. A hollowed one produces miscalculation. Rivals probe not because they expect victory, but because they expect hesitation. And hesitation, once exposed, invites repetition. NATO in this state resembles a bank that remains open but is quietly suspected of insolvency. Depositors do not need proof. Rumor suffices. One sufficiently serious crisis, misjudged, mishandled, or merely delayed, would spread strategic panic faster than any reassuring communique could contain it. The tragedy is not that NATO becomes useless. It is that it becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability, in security affairs, is rarely stabilizing. The two-tier alliance, soldiers without a community. As trust thins, NATO drifts toward a bifurcated existence. At the military level, cohesion persists. Armed forces are conservative institutions. They plan, train, and coordinate out of habit as much as conviction. Joint exercises continue. Interoperability improves. Logistics remain integrated. From the perspective of generals, NATO can function like this for years. At the political level, something more fragile erodes, the sense of shared fate. Governments begin to ask questions they once avoided. Does Washington still regard our security as intrinsically American security? Or merely as one interest among many? Is protection assumed, or negotiated? These questions rarely receive answers. That is precisely the problem. The result is a two-tier alliance, soldiers without a political community, hardware without shared purpose. This is not unprecedented. History offers uncomfortable parallels. In the interwar years, European security arrangements retained military form long after political substance had drained away. They collapsed not because they lacked forces, but because they lacked conviction. NATO's innovation is to survive this condition without admitting it exists. The alliance learns to function mechanically while doubting itself politically. That may be enough to deter routine threats. It is unlikely to deter existential ones. European self-deception, strategic autonomy as theater. Europe's greatest talent has never been power. It has been interpretation. When reality becomes uncomfortable, Europe does not deny it outright. It reframes it. It invents a vocabulary that allows weakness to be discussed as prudence, dependence as partnership, and paralysis as restraint. This talent has served the continent well in peacetime. In matters of security, it is ruinous. The current phase of European self-deception rests on a delicate fiction, that NATO remains fully reliable, while Europe is simultaneously on the verge of strategic autonomy. This is not analysis. It is stagecraft. European leaders speak solemnly of taking responsibility, burden sharing, and defense sovereignty. Defense budgets rise. Programs multiply. White papers proliferate. Yet beneath the paperwork lies a simpler truth. Europe is preparing not to replace American power, but to hedge against its absence, without admitting that this is what it is doing. This distinction matters. Replacing American guarantees would require political risk, strategic clarity, and the willingness to confront internal divisions openly. Hedging requires none of these. It requires only ambiguity and time. Europe prefers the latter. The continent continues to behave as if American protection were simultaneously indispensable and optional, something that can be relied upon without being trusted, invoked without being tested. This is not strategy. It is denial dressed up as diplomacy, quiet withdrawal, insurance, not independence. Europe will not leave the alliance. That would be too dramatic, too honest, and too dangerous. Instead, it is doing something far more characteristic, staying formally inside while slowly adjusting behavior as if guarantees were uncertain. This quiet withdrawal takes several forms. Defense spending rises, but largely on national terms. Procurement remains fragmented. Capabilities overlap inefficiently. The rhetoric is collective, the reality is sovereign. Regional clusters strengthen, not as building blocks of a unified defense, but as insurance pools. Nordic and Baltic cooperation deepens. Southern Europe hedges differently, with an eye on instability rather than invasion. No one says this aloud, but everyone plans accordingly. Most tellingly, European diplomacy becomes more cautious, not more assertive. The emphasis shifts subtly from deterrence to de-escalation, from red lines to gray zones. This is not pacifism. It is strategic adaptation to doubt. None of this constitutes betrayal. It is rational behavior by actors who sense that a system they depend on no longer rests on unquestioned commitment. Europe is not abandoning the alliance. It is preparing for the possibility that the alliance may abandon certainty, and yet, Europe insists on describing this process as progress. The disorder NATO was meant to prevent returns. The irony is thick enough to be uncomfortable. The alliance was created to prevent Europe from rearming chaotically, competitively, and without political coordination. It was designed to suppress precisely the security dilemma that plagued the continent in the first half of the 20th century. As trust in the alliance erodes, that dilemma quietly returns. A post-faith NATO does not yield stability. It yields arms races without doctrine, deterrence without confidence, and smaller states forced into binary choices they hoped history had retired. Great powers probe more boldly, not because they seek war, but because they sense hesitation. Middle powers hedge. Small states overinsure. The strategic environment becomes noisier, more volatile, and more prone to miscalculation. This is the world Europe claims it is trying to avoid. It is the world Europe is drifting into while insisting that nothing fundamental has changed. Alliances after faith. Alliances are not sustained by treaties. They are sustained by restraint, by the willingness of the powerful to treat the security of others as a moral limit on their own freedom of action. Once that restraint is questioned, everything else becomes performance. The alliance does not need to be dissolved to die. It needs only for its central guarantor to stop believing in the constraints it once accepted, and for its junior members to continue pretending that belief still exists. Greenland, in this context, was never about an island. It was about a question the alliance had avoided for 75 years. Can a security system survive when its strongest member no longer treats allied sovereignty as inviolable? If the answer is no, the alliance will endure in form, ritual, and language. Summits will be held. Communiques will be drafted. Exercises will be conducted with professional precision, and everyone involved will know, quietly, uncomfortably, that the most dangerous moment is not when the alliance collapses, it is when everyone continues to act as if it has not.